Digital Disappointment here. I'm Brad, previously known as Captain Beth or Susan Gumpo, depending on which of our other series you've watched. Today I'd like to do a bit of an in-depth tutorial on a game that's been in early access for a number of years, a game called Gnomoria. It went full release in February, and I've had a bunch of tips and information that I thought I'd put out there, since it's now got quite a nice fan base, and there's a huge variety of good workshop mods that you can download and play with. So, without further ado, in Gnomoria, you're basically managing a group of gnomes who have set out on their own to establish a new kingdom. As time goes on, you'll develop relationships with other neighboring kingdoms and so on, and things can get pretty interesting because some of those kingdoms will send emissaries that you can host, and then merchants will come to trade, and others will send warriors and whatnot who want to kill, loot, and pillage. Now, initially, you start out with just a handful of gnomes, 8 or 9, and you have a single yak and a few crates full of goods. And eventually, you're supposed to turn it into something that looks like this. Multiple pens with a variety of different animals, and stock rooms filled with all sorts of goodies, lots and lots of bedrooms with lots of gnomes, training yard with people who know how to use weapons, and if you're particularly clever, a trap-riddled entrance for the bad guys to come in. Oh, a merchant from Savage Silk has arrived. It's telling me down here. For now, I'll ignore him or her, because I've got better things to worry about. Basically, as you can see, there we go. The overall area that I've got now is fairly well developed. I've built up a bit of a dirt and stone rampart around the outside here to keep the bad guys from coming in over the sides there. I've dug down the side of this hill so that there's no easy way for them to get down there, forcing them to come through my trap-riddled entrance. Now, the traps are intelligent enough that they don't harm gnomes and merchants and whatnot that come through there. The one thing that will still trigger is if you've got bronze mechanical walls or any kind of mechanical walls and a pressure plate attached to that mechanical wall. When they step on the pressure plate, the mechanical wall will go up and they'll have to go a long way around, which is why I've got this secondary entrance. Oh, speak of the devil, we have goblins and that looks like an ogre. Alright, let's see these guys in action. The Goblin Raider is in terrible health. He's bleeding from his right leg, left leg, he's seriously injured his eye, and has fallen over. So he's not much of a threat. This Goblin Fighter, on the other hand, is... oh, he's having trouble breathing, so he's in no better shape. And there was an ogre in there somewhere. Here he is. And the ogre is bleeding from his upper body, lower body, right leg, left foot, right arm, and right hand. So my little squad of gnomes here shouldn't have too much trouble sending them on their way. They run over there, block their way in, and as they continue fighting, they summon others to their aid. Oh yeah, we know about that guy. So now they'll go through, reset the traps, clean up the corpses, clean up the artifacts left behind, like the weapons and armor. And all in all, pretty successful. There's not even a blood trail from one of my guys having been injured and heading back to get bandaged up. I've got them all set to flee the battle if they're injured and go get medical attention, because they can and will bleed to death if they don't do that. So rather than losing population to that, I set them to run back and bandage themselves, and then I'll see a blood trail that leads all the way back to this area here where the stockpiles are, and I know if anybody's been seriously injured, and I can check that out. You go into your population tab, it'll show you how many you've got, how many have died, how many are idle, how many are injured, and from there you can find your own information. It took a little while for me to fine-tune some of the processes here, so rest in peace, you may revive. Maybe what we should do is start from the beginning. In the creation process of the world, you'll start out with something that looks like this. There'll be hills, valleys, ponds, lakes, ravines, mountains, a variety of different landscape types depending on what the settings are that you play with, and the odd badger wandering around. And the eventual goal is to get down to the lower levels of the world, because as you dig deeper, you'll find different stone types, and you get further and further down. See, we are 16 down, it says over here. Down here you'll start finding things like you'll have malachite, you'll have gems, there's emeralds there. And the eventual goal is to get down to places where you find more valuable ore. Down around level 60 something, I know I've seen the platinum and gold both. I was just looking at it a little while ago over here somewhere. Oh, here we go, there's more sapphires there. Level 64 I think it was. And over here somewhere I had found gold. Gold. And the platinum's over there. So you have to dig down quite a ways in order to get to the really, really expensive materials. But along the way you'll find lots of other stuff. Copper, tin, malachite. These are all great for using as decorative materials. For example, in your Great Hall, your dining areas, bedrooms for the ambassadors or your gnomes. If you use, for example, malachite statues, their value is 500 versus something that is, well, that's a silver one. I don't even think I have any stone ones in here anymore. I've got copper, malachite, silver. Okay, let's look at a stone pillar. That'll give us a better idea. Okay, so a stone pillar is worth 90. Big difference between that and 500 for malachite. And the malachite you don't have a whole lot of other uses for, so might as well make pretty things out of it for the gnomes to be happy with. So maybe what we'll do is we'll jump out of here for now and save exit, and we'll go through the world creation stuff because there is some interesting stuff in there. My initial review that I posted on Steam of this was almost 2 years ago, and even then there was enormous functionality. There was a great deal of features. You could track just about anything however you wanted. It was a huge improvement over games like Towns and Dwarf Fortress that were listed as inspirations for this. Anybody who played Dwarf Fortress knows just what a masochistic experience that is. Towns was a huge leap forward in terms of the user interface, but it eventually got abandoned and the development on it stopped. So when you're creating a new game, you've got your kingdom name, which you can randomize. There we go, the Grove Kingdom. You can choose what size of map you want and the difficulty. Okay? The event setup is where you'll have a whole lot better control over the fine details. You can actually pick a kingdom seed if you have one that you've played before that you thought was great and you just got your ass kicked because you had the difficulty set too high, or found it easy because you had the difficulty set too low. You can customize the type of landscape that you've got here. Right? What do we have? Let's start with the Kingdom Center, I suppose. Kingdom Center, these two numbers here, will shift the focus of your map. The left box shifts the map focus up and to the left if you put a positive number in there, and the right box shifts the map up and to the right with a positive number. So that's the X and Y axis, or actually X and Z axis across the map, I should say. The other settings that are worth noting, if you have this slider here for the flat to tall tinkered with, it affects the overall height of hills and mountains. At the flat end, you'll get more like the plains into foothills type of landscape with low rolling hills, wider spaces on top of or between the hills. And at the tall end, you'll get more like the mountains side of the foothills, where you'll have some really, really steep vertical climbs. Some of them will just be sheer cliff faces, and they can reach pretty decent height. On the second slider, you've got wide hills versus narrow hills. That's pretty self-explanatory. The size of the hills and mountains are affected accordingly. Flat end, pardon me, flat end. The narrow end gets more extreme slopes that will run into each other, and you'll have like the downslope of one hill or mountain colliding with the next one over. Whereas the wide end increases the width of each elevation and increases the step size. So, for example, let's do a preview here. If you have that set to the wider end of things, these individual steps that form into little terraces will tend to be wider, and at the narrow end you'll tend to get ones that are skinnier or non-existent like this, or sheer cliffs along this kind of idea, and like so, and along here. Okay, and we'll escape out of there. And the third slider, smooth to bumpy, again is fairly self-explanatory. It affects the general texture of the terrain. At the smooth end, it'll look more like a weather-eroded slope, more of a rolling, smooth feel to it, whereas the bumpy end tends to be more lumpy, and there's lots of little crags and drop-offs and things like that, sort of like what we were highlighting there on the map. The difficulty is fairly self-explanatory in terms of the settings. There's 5 different settings: peaceful, easy, normal, hard, or sudden death. They obviously are increasing in difficulty. If you set it to easy, you'll see these sliders are set accordingly. If you set it to normal, they go up a little, go up to hard, they go up a little further, and sudden death, it gets kind of ugly. Alright, let's put that back to normal. The metal depth, you can set it to shallow, normal, or deep. It just affects how deep you have to dig to get to the rich stuff. On normal, you'll get gold and platinum forming around -60, as I showed in that world I was in. The metal amount obviously is just going to adjust how plentiful it is, so how often you'll run across it. And I think it also affects the size of the veins to some degree, but it's more so the frequency of them than the size. Now, if you want to tinker with the difficulty and make your own custom difficulty level, you can certainly do that. As soon as you start playing with any of these sliders, or enabling and disabling things, it sets it to custom. Even if you put it back to 1, 1, and 1, and everything's enabled like it was, it'll still say custom. So if you happen to tinker with something, put it back, and then notice in your game later it says custom difficulty, don't panic. You probably are on whatever you selected, whether you went normal or easy, or hard or sudden death. If you happen to have clicked something off and on again, it stays set as custom. The enemy strength shows the relative strength of enemy attacks, it says. A higher number makes the individuals tougher. The attack rate is how often they'll come. So it'll reduce the time between attacks. If you want there to be more attacks, you set this number higher. The third slider here, attack size, is the number of enemies that come per attack. So if you want a lot of weak critters, you could set this one high and this one low, and you may or may not see ogres. I don't know exactly what setting you start seeing ogres at, but you'll end up seeing lots of goblins, because this is up here, and they'll stay relatively weak over the course of time. Put those back though. Increase enemy strength over time. Normally, this is off because the enemy strength, as the tooltip says, will increase over time based on your kingdom worth. So if your overall kingdom has a value of 5,000, you'll get a lot weaker attacks than you will if your overall kingdom worth is 50,000 or 150,000. I think the current kingdom worth for my world that I was just in is around 100,000, and ogres have been coming to see me for a little while. The overall value hasn't changed a lot, so it seems like they started showing up around 80 or 90,000 possibly. If you have walled in your place like I did, but unlike me, you leave no ways in or out for the new nomads and diplomats and merchants, the goblins can actually tunnel into your kingdom and you don't really have a lot of control over where the hell they come in. So if you have this enabled, it's a really good idea to leave yourself one course of entry so you can trap the hell out of it and have your guys able to bottleneck them there rather than them just tunneling up in the middle of a civilian area where you've got a bunch of untrained or unarmed gnomes doing their farming or whatever, because the goblins, they will massacre your livestock as well. If that's the first thing they run across, your livestock will get butchered. So sometimes that'll give you a bit of a clue ahead of time if your gnomes haven't spotted them, but you notice blood spots forming in one of your animal pens where your gnomes haven't been to in a little while. There's a pretty good possibility that goblins or something else have shown up and attacked them. Typically the wild animals, badgers, bears, that kind of thing, won't go after the livestock. That's only a humanoid type thing like the goblins, the manse, etc. Speaking of which, goblins and manse will come overland, so if you have walled yourself in and disabled this, they can't get to you. On the other end of the spectrum, you have things that will spawn underground, like zombies, skeletons, beetles, spiders. And then there's a special scenario for the golems. Golems will spawn wherever you have a mass of unstocked materials. So if you have dug a huge excavation out and there's thousands of pieces of stone laying around, you're really wise to create a stockpile and get them to move all that stuff into a stockpile and control the amounts of it that's in the stockpiles, so then you can separate it off into smaller groups that won't spontaneously form into golems. Unless you want the golem cores, which we can talk about later. So for now, we're going to go with a relatively easy setup here. Let's go. What does easy look like? Okay. Let's drop everything down to the low end of things just for this tutorial here. Okay, metal depth, metal amount we'll leave normal. And kingdom, let's take a look at that again. Alright. When you're generating a map, there's a few things to keep in mind. You'll want to have access to fruit trees, apples, oranges, because they're an easy source of early game food and they are pretty crucial throughout. So here, I've got orange trees, lots of them, but no apples. If I want the variety, then I need to generate a new map or shift the center of this one. If I'm happy with just having oranges, then that's fine. You'll also want to make sure that you have birch trees, because birch trees produce higher quality good or higher value goods. So when you make a puzzle box or a statue out of birch, it will inherently be worth more than if it's made out of pine, because it's a finer, higher quality wood. People are more willing to pay for birch statues or birch furniture than pine. It's always good to have more than one type of wood, though, because if you're reserving your your birch for things like furniture, doors, tables, chairs, and exports, you'll want something of a crappier, rougher wood for the utilitarian things like crates and barrels, workbenches, and stuff like that for the workshops. You don't need to use high-end wood for that. It's kind of a waste. It also will artificially bloat your kingdom worth when you could get away with using cheaper materials and keeping your kingdom worth a little bit lower so as to not attract quite so much attention from hostiles. So for the case of the tutorial here, we'll say that just having oranges is fine, but you guys can figure out what apple trees look like. It's not too hard when you see them. They're bigger and they've got red apples instead of oranges. Now when you do this preview, it just generates the topography. So it very quickly can render a layout of the mountains and hills, all that jazz. But when you actually click the generate button here, that's when it does the guts below the surface, the 140 layers below what it just showed you here. So when you click this generate button, be prepared to spend a few minutes watching it do this little slider bar. So for now, I will pause here and we will return after the slider bar is completed.